everyone, today in this video we will see the identification of ribs. Now as thoracic skeleton it is made up of the sternum, ribs and the vertebra. Now there are total 12 ribs on each side, out of which few ribs are the typical, few are the atypical. So the first rib, second rib, 10th rib, 11th rib and the 12th rib, these are the atypical ribs, and the remaining, that is from 3rd to 9th, are the typical ribs. Now let's see the general features of the typical rib. Now typical rib, it has two ends. One is the anterior end and another one it is the posterior end. Now how will you identify these two ends? So anterior end, it has a concave facet. Here you can see this one is the concave facet, and this concave facet, it articulates with its costal cartilage. And posterior end you can identify by the presence of the head, then neck and the tubercle. Now head, it has two facets. Upper facet it is smaller and the lower facet it is larger, and in between these two facets we have a crest. This one is the neck, which has two surfaces and two borders, right? And this one is the tubercle. So tubercles, this tubercle, it has two parts. One is articular tubercle. So this medially placed tubercle, it is the articular tubercle, and this one is the non-articular part of the tubercle. Now head, it articulates, this lower larger facet, it articulates with the numerically corresponding vertebra, and this upper smaller facet, it articulates with the upper vertebrae. See, always remember the facet which is larger, that articulates with the numerically corresponding vertebra. Suppose this one is the rib, so rib articulates with the same number of the vertebra, this lower larger facet. In vertebra, what happen? In the vertebra, the superior facet which is placed on the body side of the body of the thoracic vertebra, it articulates with the numerically corresponding rib. Then here medial portion, it articulates on the medial part of the tubercle, this articular part, it articulates with the facet which is placed on the transverse process of the numerically corresponding vertebra, and it forms the costo-transverse joint, and here they form the costo-vertebral joint. Now shaft of the rib. So here we can see this one is the outer surface of the rib, this is the inner surface. It has upper border and it has the lower border. Now inner surface, it is smooth, and near the lower margin there is a groove. This groove, it is known as the costal groove. So posterior intercostal vessels and nerves, they are protected within this costal groove. Now this 5 cm distal to the tubercle, here there is a cross ridge, and this corresponds with the angle of the shaft of the rib. Now this one is the upper border, and upper border, it has two lips. So this one is the outer lip and this one is the inner lip of the typical rib. So for the identification of the typical rib, first you have to look for the anterior end and the posterior end, then this convex surface, that is the outer surface, then this one is the concave surface, that is the inner surface, and you have to keep this costal groove near the lower border. So this one is the left rib. Now if you see the first rib, so this one is the anterior end of the first rib. So anterior end of the first rib, it is pitted, right, and it is more concave. Then this one is the posterior end, it is small and rounded. Then on the superior surface, ridges are present near the anterior end, and here near the inner margin there is a tubercle, and this tubercle, it is known as the scalene tubercle. For the side determination of the first rib, first identify the anterior end and the posterior end, then place the rib on the flat surface. So when you place it on the flat surface, both the ends, they touch the surface. So this way you can determine the side of the first rib. Now let's move to the second rib, that is the second atypical rib. So here you can see this one is the first rib and this is the second rib, right? So second rib, the length of the second rib, it is almost twice that of the first rib. First thing. Second thing, it is also almost curved rib, same as that of the first rib. Here the non-articular part of the posterior end, here you can see this is the articular part of the posterior end and this one is the non-articular part. So this non-articular part of the second rib, it is small, and here you can see this is the angle. So angle, it is close to the tubercle of the second rib. Now if you see this shaft of the second rib, so here you can see this one is the outer surface of the second rib, this one is the inner surface of the second rib, then again it has the upper border, so this is the upper border, and this one is the lower border of the second rib. But if you compare the outer surface, see this one is the typical rib, and in the typical rib this shaft is almost completely twisted, and this outer surface, it is convex and it is directed laterally, whereas in this first rib, what happened, this surface, that it becomes the superior surface, and in the second rib, it is in between these two. This one is not completely lateral, but it is more like the upward. So in the first we have the superior surface. Here in the second rib we have, this is the outer surface, but it is not completely directed outward, but it is more upward directed. Then this one is the smooth surface, and this smooth surface, that is the inner surface. And here also you can see the costal groove, but this costal groove, it is clearly, we can see it in the posterior part of the second rib. But one of the most characteristic feature of the second rib, that is somewhere in the middle of the outer surface of the shaft of the second rib, we have a tuberosity, and this tuberosity provides insertion to the first and half digitations of the serratus anterior muscle. In both these rib you can see this is the tuberosity. Now let's see the 10th thoracic rib. So 10th thoracic rib, it is same as that of the typical rib. It has anterior and posterior and the shaft, but the important characteristic feature, that is at the posterior and there is a single facet. So single large facet, and it articulates with the 10th vertebrae. Now these are the two last ribs, that is the 11th rib and the 12th ribs. Now these are also known as the floating ribs or the vertebral ribs, because their anterior end, it is like a tip, anterior end, it is the free end. So these are known as the floating ribs. In the 11th rib there is no neck or tubercle. Here you can see there is no tubercle or no neck, but here on the inner surface we can see a poorly marked costal groove is present and slight angle is present. So this one is the 11th rib. In the 12th rib also there is no neck or tubercle. Even on the inner surface there is no costal groove or angle is present. So this one is the 12th rib. There are few terminologies like true ribs and the false ribs. So true ribs are also known as the vertebrosternal ribs. So the first 7 ribs, they are known as the true ribs because they articulate through their cartilages to the sternum. So they are known as the true ribs. And the remaining 5 ribs, they are the false ribs. Out of this, the cartilages of the 8th, 9th and 10th, they join to the next higher cartilage, and that's why it is also known as the vertebrochondral ribs. And the last 2, that is 11th and 12th, they are known as the floating ribs or the vertebral ribs.